The rain had been falling for weeks, drenching the Mississippi Delta in an unrelenting downpour that seemed to seep into the very bones of the land. On the morning of April 15th, when the first levee cracked open near Greenville, Mississippi, the roar of water echoed like the call of something ancient, something hungry. Samuel Hargrove stood on the wooden porch of his modest farmhouse, staring out at the swelling river beyond the fields. He had lived through floods before, but something about this one felt different. The air was thick with more than just humidity. It carried a weight of impending doom, a sense that this was no ordinary rising tide. Inside the house, his wife Clara clutched their newborn daughter close to her chest, her eyes darting to the windows as if expecting the water to come rushing in at any moment. "Samuel," she whispered, her voice trembling, "the river's angry." Samuel didn't reply. He knew she was right. Folks had been talking about it down at the general store, how the river wasn't just swelling, it was devouring everything in its path. Whole towns were disappearing under the murky depths, swallowed up by the dark, churning water. And now it was here. By nightfall, the first wave hit. The wooden fence that lined their property was the first to go, swept away in an instant. The barn followed shortly after, collapsing under the relentless force. Samuel had barely enough time to grab what few belongings they could carry before the water reached the steps of their house. As they fled towards the levee, the cries of their neighbors filled the night air. Men, women, and children struggled against the rising current, their faces contorted in terror. But what truly unsettled Samuel wasn't the flood itself. It was the things he saw moving beneath the water. Shadows, too large and too fast, gliding just beneath the surface. Clara screamed when she saw it too, an arm pale and lifeless, floating just beyond their reach. But as the moonlight reflected off the surface, Samuel realized it wasn't a corpse at all. It moved, it reached, and then it vanished beneath the flood, dragging something with it. Panic spread through the town like wildfire. Boats capsized in the rushing current, their occupants disappearing beneath the waves. The levees groaned under the pressure, wooden planks snapping like brittle bones. Samuel pushed forward, determined to get his family to higher ground. But with every step, the flood seemed to grow darker, colder, like it was alive, like it knew their names. They found shelter in an overcrowded church perched on a rare patch of dry land. The preacher, a gaunt man with wild eyes, welcomed them inside. "The river's taken more than just our homes," he said, his voice a raspy whisper. "It's taken our dead, too, and they're coming back." Samuel exchanged a worried glance with Clara, but before he could ask what the man meant, a heavy knock sounded at the church door. A knock that came from the waterlogged darkness outside. And then the screaming began. The pounding on the church doors grew louder, a heavy, rhythmic force that sent shivers down Samuel's spine. The preacher's eyes darted around the room, his hands trembling as he clutched the worn leather of his Bible. "Stay away from the windows," he warned in a voice barely above a whisper. "It ain't just the flood out there." Clara pressed their baby closer to her chest, her knuckles white with fear. The other townsfolk huddled together in uneasy silence, their damp clothes clinging to their trembling bodies. Some murmured prayers, others simply stared at the flickering candles that barely pushed back the encroaching darkness. Samuel moved toward the entrance, his boots squelching against the soaked wooden floor. He pressed his ear against the thick oak door, listening. The knocking had stopped, but something was there. He could hear it, a soft, gurgling sound, like a drowning man gasping for air. He swallowed hard and reached for the latch, but the preacher grabbed his arm with surprising strength. "No," the old man hissed. "You open that door, and we're all damned." Samuel hesitated. His instincts screamed at him to look, to make sure no one was out there in need of help. But the fear in the preacher's face, pure, unshakable fear, kept his hand from turning the handle. A scream from one of the women near the back of the church shattered the tense quiet. "Something's at the window." Everyone turned in unison. A face, pale and waterlogged, pressed against the glass. Its mouth gaped wide in a silent scream, eyes staring, unblinking, as river water dripped down the glass in sluggish streams. Then, without warning, the figure dissolved into the darkness, leaving only a smeared outline of something inhuman on the pane. "Dear God," Clara whimpered. "What was that?" The preacher's voice trembled as he spoke. The river doesn't just take, it gives back. The ones who drowned, the ones lost to the current, they come back different, and they want us with them. A panicked murmur spread through the crowd. An elderly man, soaked to the bone, stepped forward. "We have to leave," he insisted. "If we stay here, we'll be trapped." "No," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his gut. "We need to stay put until daylight. Moving in the dark, that's suicide." As if to answer his argument, the sound of rushing water echoed from outside. The flood had reached the church steps. The murky water lapped at the wood, creeping in through the cracks in the door. It smelled of decay, of something long dead and rotting beneath the river's surface. And then the whispering began. It came from the water, faint at first, like a breeze rustling through the trees, but it grew louder, distinct. Voices. Familiar voices. "Samuel!" He froze, his blood turning to ice. It was his father's voice, long gone, lost to the river over a decade ago. "Samuel, let us in." Clara gasped, pulling him back. "Don't listen." But Samuel couldn't move. The whispering filled his ears, seeping into his mind like the floodwaters creeping under the door. "We miss you, son. Come home." His breath came in ragged gasps. He could feel the water rising around his ankles now. The whispers were inside his head, pushing, pulling, drowning him in memories he had long buried. And then the baby cried. The sharp, desperate sound snapped him back to reality. He turned to Clara, who was already ankle-deep in the chilling water, tears streaming down her face. "Samuel, please," she begged. "We have to do something." The preacher's voice rose above the chaos, desperate and commanding. "The church bell, we ring it, and maybe, just maybe, the sound will drive them away." Samuel didn't hesitate this time. He pushed through the water, through the panicked crowd, and climbed the rickety stairs to the bell tower. With every step, the whispers grew louder, the weight of unseen hands clawing at his legs, trying to pull him under. Reaching the rope, he pulled with all his might. The bell's deep, resounding toll echoed through the night, cutting through the whispers, the water, the fear, and outside something screamed. The sound that echoed outside was not human. It was deep, guttural, and filled with an otherworldly rage that made Samuel's blood run cold. He pulled the bell rope again, each toll reverberating through the night like a desperate cry for salvation. The walls of the old church trembled with each ring, but the water kept rising, creeping higher, black and thick as oil. Below him, the congregation huddled together in terror. Some prayed, others sobbed quietly, their faces pale and hollow in the dim candlelight. Clara clung to their baby, whispering soothing words, but her wide eyes darted to the doors, to the windows, to the shadows, shifting just beyond the church's fragile walls. The preacher stood by the pulpit, his voice cracking as he read from the Bible, his hands trembling with every verse. "Though I walk through the valley of the shadow of death, I will fear no evil." His voice faltered when the whispering returned, louder this time, swirling around the church like a relentless tide. And then, another knock at the door. This time it wasn't frantic or forceful. It was slow, deliberate, as if something or someone was waiting. Samuel could see the wood splintering under the pressure, the water pressing in harder now. He scrambled down from the bell tower, his boots splashing in the knee-high flood. "Samuel," the voice whispered again. This time it came from inside the church. He spun around, heart hammering, but saw nothing. Just the faces of his neighbors, wide-eyed and stricken with fear. Then the whispering came again, closer, breathing against his ear. "Why did you leave us, Samuel?" He turned sharply, and there they were. The faces of the dead, pressed against the fogged-up windows, their lifeless eyes staring into the church with a hungry, unnatural longing. Men and women he had known, neighbors, friends, family, drowned and bloated, their skin stretched thin over their waterlogged bones. Their mouths moved in unison, but no words came out. Only that dreadful, endless whispering. The preacher cried out, his voice raw with desperation. "They're not your loved ones. They're what the river turned them into." A scream tore through the crowd as a window shattered. The flood surged in, carrying with it something that clawed and thrashed, its limbs jerking in unnatural spasms. A man, at least, what had once been a man. His face was twisted, his skin pale and torn, his fingers bent into grotesque shapes. He lunged toward the nearest person, and the church erupted in chaos. Samuel grabbed Clara's hand, dragging her toward the altar, as the others scrambled to escape the icy grasp of the drowned man. The preacher swung an old wooden cross at the creature, his voice rising in frantic prayer, but the thing barely flinched. "Out! Out the back!" Samuel shouted, pushing Clara and the baby toward the rear entrance. The water was nearly waist-high now, and the entire church groaned under the pressure. They stumbled through the cold, black flood, each step heavier, the pull of the current growing stronger. But the whispering didn't stop. It wrapped around them, taunting, calling. "Come home, Samuel. Come to us." Outside, the flood had transformed the town into a watery graveyard. Houses stood half-submerged, their rooftops barely visible above the rising tide. Pieces of furniture, broken doors, and lifeless bodies floated aimlessly in the current. The Mississippi had swallowed everything, and it was still hungry. Samuel led Clara up a small hill behind the church, where a cluster of oak trees stood firm against the tide. They could see others climbing onto rooftops, waving frantically for help that wouldn't come. The river stretched as far as the eye could see, an endless, churning abyss of black water and floating corpses. Clara sobbed into Samuel's chest. "Where do we go? There's nothing left." Before he could answer, a distant figure emerged from the water, walking slowly toward them. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its skin stretched tightly over its frame. Its eyes were hollow, empty, yet locked onto Samuel with an unmistakable intent. "Samuel," it whispered, a twisted smile forming on its face. "You can't escape the river." Samuel's grip on Clara tightened. He knew, deep down, that the river didn't just flood the land. It took something from everyone who dared to defy it, and now it wanted him too. Samuel's breath came in ragged gasps as he stared at the figure emerging from the water. It moved with a slow, unnatural grace, its feet gliding through the flood without a ripple. The moonlight revealed the hollow features of its face, skin stretched taut over sharp bones, eyes that seemed to see through him, through everything. "Samuel." The voice was familiar, yet wrong, twisted. It sounded like his father's, but laced with something darker, something ancient that had dwelled beneath the river long before anyone had settled here. Clara whimpered beside him, holding their baby tightly, her gaze locked on the approaching figure. "Samuel, what is that?" she whispered. He couldn't answer. He didn't know. Behind them, the church groaned as the floodwaters pushed harder, sending debris and shattered pews floating past. The preacher's voice still rang out from inside, but it was weakening, swallowed by the rising tide. Samuel knew they had no time. He had to get Clara and the baby somewhere safe. He pulled her along, stepping carefully through the waterlogged field, but the figure in the river followed, and it wasn't alone anymore. More shapes were emerging. Silent, staring, their expressions frozen in eerie stillness. Some Samuel recognized. The old storekeeper, Mr. Reeves, gone missing weeks ago. Sheriff Mitchell, who had been swallowed by the flood, trying to save a stranded family. And among them, his sister. Eliza, Samuel choked, his feet faltering in the water. She had drowned when they were children, dragged under by the same river that now threatened to take everything. Her wet, matted hair clung to her face, her eyes empty and accusing. "You left me," she whispered, her voice carried on the wind like a funeral hymn. Clara tugged his arm, her voice frantic. "Samuel, please." He tore his gaze away, his heart pounding, and trudged forward through the thick, clinging mud. The whispers followed. They grew louder, more insistent, promising things he couldn't bear to hear. "You can't run, Samuel." Ahead, an old barn loomed out of the water, half submerged but still standing. It wasn't much, but it was shelter. He hurried Clara inside, pushing against the stubborn door until it creaked open, revealing the dark, musty interior. They stumbled inside, sloshing through the rising water. The air was thick with the scent of damp hay and rot. Samuel jammed a broken wooden beam against the door, sealing them in as best he could. In the darkness, Clara sobbed, rocking their baby gently. "We can't stay here forever, Samuel. They'll find us." "I know," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. He could still hear them outside, moving through the flood with slow, deliberate steps. They were waiting. Samuel ran a trembling hand through his soaked hair, his mind racing. There had to be a way out, a way to survive. Then something moved behind them. Samuel spun around, his breath caught in his throat. The shadows in the barn shifted, and a figure stepped forward. A man, drenched and trembling, his eyes wide with terror. "Who's there?" Samuel called out, raising the rusty pitchfork he had grabbed from the corner. The man staggered closer, his face illuminated by the faint sliver of moonlight that filtered through the cracks in the barn. "Help me," he croaked, his voice raw. They won't stop coming." Samuel recognized him. Jed Carter, a farmer from a few miles down the road, or at least what was left of him. His clothes were torn, his skin bruised and waterlogged, and deep scratches lined his arms as if he'd been clawing at something in desperation. They whispered to me too," Jed said, his eyes wild. "They said if I joined them, the water wouldn't take me. But they lied. Oh God, they lied." Samuel swallowed hard, his grip tightening on the pitchfork. "Jed, we need to get out of here. The barn won't hold." Jed let out a hollow laugh. "You think you can run? The river, it knows us, Samuel. It knows our sins. You can't escape it." A sudden thud rattled the barn walls, followed by a low, wet scraping sound. Clara gasped, clutching Samuel's arm. "They're here." Samuel took a step back, positioning himself between Clara and the door. The sound of wet footsteps sloshed outside, circling the barn, their whispers turning to low, guttural chants. The wood groaned under the pressure. Jed let out a sob. "We're already dead," he whispered, before lunging toward the door. "Jed, no!" Samuel shouted, but it was too late. Jed yanked the beam away and threw the door open. The water surged in, carrying the figures with it. They reached for him, their skeletal hands dragging him into the flood, his screams cut short as he vanished beneath the black surface. Samuel slammed the door shut again, panting. The water was rising, and their time was running out. He turned to Clara, his jaw set with determination. "We have to make a run for it. We'll follow the ridge north, higher ground." Clara nodded, her tears mixing with the rain dripping from the barn roof. "Okay, but hurry, Samuel. I can't do this much longer." With one final deep breath, Samuel lifted the baby into his arms and pushed open the barn's side door. The figures stood in the water, watching, waiting. And as they stepped out into the flood, the whispers returned, stronger than ever. "Come home, Samuel." Samuel pushed through the waist-deep water, his arms wrapped tightly around the baby as Clara struggled beside him. The cold bit into his skin, sending waves of shivers through his body, but he didn't stop. He couldn't. The figures in the water were watching, their hollow eyes tracking every move, and the whispering never stopped. "Higher ground," Samuel muttered under his breath, more to himself than Clara. "We just need to get to higher ground." Clara's voice was raw with exhaustion. "They're everywhere, Samuel." He risked a glance over his shoulder, and his heart nearly stopped. The figures had multiplied, their pale, bloated faces emerging from the murky water like grotesque lilies. They weren't moving quickly, but they were closing in, their arms reaching out, their lips moving silently as they chanted that terrible, endless whisper. Samuel's grip on Clara tightened. "Keep moving, honey. We're almost there." But deep down, he knew it was a lie. They trudged forward, the muddy current tugging at their legs like unseen hands trying to drag them under. Every step felt heavier, every breath shallower. The wind howled through the drowned trees, bending them like skeletal fingers pointing the way to nowhere. Then, from somewhere in the distance, a sound, sharp and piercing. A gunshot. Clara gasped. "Did you hear that?" Samuel nodded, his mind racing. It meant someone else was alive out here, someone fighting to survive. Or worse, it meant something was being fought off. "Over there!" Clara pointed to a faint light flickering in the distance, perched on a ridge just above the rising flood. Hope, small but undeniable, sparked in Samuel's chest. They pushed through the water, moving faster now, but the river wasn't ready to let them go. It shifted beneath them, rippling unnaturally, and then something cold wrapped around Samuel's ankle. He barely had time to react before he was pulled under. The world turned black. The river swallowed him whole, and the whispers, they were inside him now, filling his ears, his head, his lungs. "Come home, Samuel. It's so much easier down here." He thrashed wildly, his arms flailing, the baby's weight pressing against his chest. He kicked hard, felt something slick and strong trying to drag him deeper. Then hands, real hands, grabbed him, pulling him back to the surface. Clara's voice, frantic and desperate. "Samuel, hold on!" Coughing and sputtering, Samuel broke through the water, gasping for breath. His eyes locked onto Clara's terrified face as she struggled to keep them afloat. He coughed violently, spitting out river water, his heart pounding wildly. "Go, Clara! Keep moving!" They scrambled forward, half running, half swimming, the figures in the water falling behind but never far enough. Every splash, every ripple sent icy dread crawling down Samuel's spine. Finally, they reached the base of the ridge. The ground was firmer here, rising above the flood, and the flickering light, an old lantern hung from the porch of a house that had somehow survived the devastation. Samuel pounded on the door with trembling fists. "Please, open up." For a moment, there was only silence. Then the door creaked open just enough for a man to peer through the gap. His eyes were bloodshot, his face lined with exhaustion. "Who's out there?" The man asked warily. Samuel gasped, his lungs burning. "Please, my wife, my baby, we need help." The man hesitated for a long moment, then yanked the door open. "Get inside. Now!" Samuel practically collapsed through the doorway, pulling Clara in behind him. The door slammed shut, and a thick wooden beam was dropped across it. The man, tall and wiry, stared at them with suspicion. "You got followed?" Samuel nodded, still catching his breath. "They're out there, in the water." The man's face darkened. "Yeah, they always are." Samuel glanced around the small, cluttered room. Canned food, blankets, and a rifle leaning against the wall. The place reeked of damp wood and fear. "Name's Curtis," the man said, his eyes flicking to the window. "You're lucky I heard you." Samuel sat Clara down on a dry spot near the fireplace. The baby stirred but didn't cry, exhausted from the ordeal. Samuel turned to Curtis. "What's happening out there? What are they?" Curtis wiped a trembling hand across his face. "The river." He swallowed hard. "It's cursed, mister. Always has been. When the flood came, it didn't just take homes. It took people. And it don't let go." Samuel's hands clenched into fists. "But they're dead." Curtis shook his head. "No, they ain't. There's something worse now." Clara, her voice barely above a whisper, asked, "What do they want?" Curtis looked out the window, his face etched with something between fear and sorrow. "They want us in the water." A sudden thud against the door made them all jump. Curtis raised his rifle, his knuckles white. "They found you." Outside, the whispers returned, louder than before. "Samuel, let us in." And this time, the voice belonged to his mother. The pounding on the door grew louder, each thud reverberating through the small house like a drumbeat of doom. Samuel tightened his grip on Clara's hand, his pulse hammering in his ears. Curtis stood by the door, rifle at the ready, his face pale but determined. "Don't listen," Curtis muttered, his eyes locked on the trembling wood. "They get in your head, make you see things, hear things. It's how they take you." Outside, the voice of Samuel's mother, soft, pleading, filtered through the cracks in the walls. "Samuel, baby, it's cold out here. Let me in, won't you?" His breath caught in his throat. The flood had taken her years ago, swept her away when he was just a boy. He'd never even found her body, and yet she was here, or whatever it was. Clara's grip on his arm tightened. "Samuel, don't." He swallowed hard and stepped back from the door. The whispers hissed and scratched at the edges of his mind, but he held on to the only truth he knew. His mother was gone. Whatever was out there, it wasn't her. "There's no way out, is there?" Clara asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Curtis glanced at her, then at Samuel, his eyes hollow. "Not while the water's up, but it'll go down. It always does." Samuel wasn't so sure. The river had never been like this before. This was different. The flood had taken more than their homes, more than their land. It had taken their dead and twisted them into something that should not exist. A wet, slithering noise came from the window, and Samuel's stomach lurched. Shadows pressed against the glass, distorted faces staring in, their mouths moving in silent, endless pleas. "Come with us, Samuel. Come back home." Curtis gritted his teeth and raised his rifle. "Get away from here," he bellowed, firing a shot through the glass. The explosion was deafening in the tight space, and the figures outside recoiled, their pale forms vanishing beneath the dark water. For a moment, everything was still. Then the whispering resumed, stronger than ever. "We have to move," Samuel said, his voice firm. "We can't stay here. We need to get to higher ground." Curtis shook his head. "You don't understand, do you? Higher ground don't matter. The river's everywhere. It's not just water anymore." Samuel's jaw clenched. "Then what do we do? Just wait here and die?" Curtis sighed, his shoulders sagging. "No, we fight." He handed Samuel a heavy axe from the corner of the room. "They don't like fire." And they sure as hell don't like steel. Samuel took the weapon, its weight grounding him. He nodded, determination settling into his bones. Then we make our stand. Curtis pushed a dresser in front of the window, while Samuel braced the door with anything they could find. Clara held the baby close, whispering a soft prayer. Outside, the whispering turned into a deafening wail. The water surged higher, slamming against the walls, and then the door buckled. Samuel raised the axe, bracing for whatever came through. With a splintering crack, the door burst open. The flood poured in, and with it came the drowned, pale, bloated, reaching. Their dead, soulless eyes fixed on Samuel, and for a fleeting moment, he saw his mother's face among them. But he didn't hesitate. He swung the axe, and the thing wearing his mother's face shrieked, recoiling as the blade tore through its waterlogged flesh. "Burn them!" Curtis roared, tossing a lit kerosene lamp into the water. Flames roared to life, consuming the nearest figures in crackling, oily fire. Samuel grabbed Clara's hand and pulled her toward the back door. "Go. Run!" They burst out into the night, the flood swirling around their knees, flames licking at the wooden frame of the house behind them. The whispers turned to screams, but Samuel didn't look back. He focused on the ridge ahead, on the promise of something, anything, beyond the river's reach. The water dragged at their legs, pulling, tugging, pleading. But Samuel pressed on, Clara beside him, the baby safe in her arms. Finally, they reached the high ground, the flood stretching behind them like an endless sea. Samuel turned, panting, watching as the burning house disappeared beneath the dark water. The whispering faded. They had made it. Samuel collapsed onto the damp earth, pulling Clara and the baby close. They sat in exhausted silence, the weight of survival settling heavily on their shoulders. Curtis, limping and soaked, emerged from the trees a few moments later, his face grim but alive. He dropped to the ground beside them, staring out at the endless flood. "Ain't over," he muttered. "The river? It always comes back." Samuel looked out at the dark, swirling waters below, at the ghostly shapes moving beneath the surface. It wasn't over, and deep down he knew the river would never let them go. The end.